Hi everyone, welcome to Buy the Book. Today we're going to be starting off the Adventures of Tintin reviews, and we're going to be starting off with Land of the Soviets, the very first book in the Adventures of Tintin series. So Land of the Soviets was originally serialised back between 1929 and 1930, and it was during the time that Hergé was working at a newspaper called, excuse my pronunciation here, Le Petit Vingtième. I think that's how you say it, I'm not 100% sure, but yeah, that's the newspaper where he worked. And the character of Tintin actually kind of evolved from another character that Hergé had previously created, who was called Totor. And if you guys have a look on the internet, you'll see pictures of Totor, you'll see what he looks like. You may even find some of the original comic strips that Totor was a part of as well. And you might notice that some of the mannerisms, some of the character traits that kind of came to define Tintin were also very present in Totor as well. Okay, so let's begin the review and talk a little bit about Tintin in the Land of the Soviets. Is it a good story? Is it one of the more iconic Tintin stories, or is it one of the ones that maybe we should forget a little bit because of some of the content and because of some of the kind of contemporary day views, which are no longer, let's just say, popular with how some of the earlier comics of the Tintin series were. So, just to kind of give you a brief background of the story. So, Tintin, the Land of Soviets is obviously mostly set in Soviet Russia. It was during the time of Stalin's rule, and obviously this was a very brutal period during the Soviet Union. And yeah, at the very start of the story, Tintin departs from Brussels in Belgium, which is his hometown, and he starts heading towards Moscow to do some reporting on what life is like for the Soviet citizens who live in the Soviet Union. And I did notice that when the story started, things got going very, very quickly. Pretty much after, I think, about 2 pages, or maybe even just 1 page, Tintin already finds himself in a bit of trouble on the train, in which a Soviet spy, or I can't remember the name of it, but it's some kind of like secret service that used to work within the Soviet Union. It's not the KGB; it was given another name in the book. I think it's some sort of spy network, and this guy is a part of this spy network. And basically, he sets off a bomb. It destroys most of the train. For some reason, the train just sort of keeps going. Even though it was basically blown to pieces, and a lot of the carriages were all smashed, and the roofs were blown off and everything, it still does continue all the way to Berlin. At which point, Tintin then has to do a changeover to then carry on to Moscow. And before, Tintin even gets to Moscow, which is actually quite a bit later on in the book, I mean, the amount of times that he comes under attack, he gets like an attempt on his life, he gets attempted, or someone attempts to kill him, someone attempts to hurt him, injure him, stop him from getting to Russia in some way, is absolutely insane. And this is kind of one of the more, I would say, certainly negative aspects of the book. I just feel like that there are a lot of overused gags in this story. And this is kind of one of my main problems with the book itself, because although yes, it does tell a continuing story, it does just feel like a lot of the time it is just effectively gag after gag after gag after gag after stunt over and over and over again, and it does get quite tiresome pretty quickly. Some of the ways that these gags are resolved as well, I don't think are particularly effective. One example that I'll give you guys is that there's a point later on in the story when Tintin finds himself in a Soviet jail, and the jail starts filling up with water because the river outside has burst its banks. And for whatever reason, there's just a random diving suit that has been put inside the jail. Tintin puts on the diving suit, and then he effectively just swims out of the jail, which has started flooding up. And it just feels like lazy writing in many cases. It feels like Hergé, obviously, because this story was serialised, that he effectively probably wrote Tintin into a situation the week before, when it was being released in Le Petit Vingtième, and then like the following week when the next few pages were going to be released in the magazine, it's like he didn't really know how to resolve the situation, so he just had to write, oh, I'll just put a diving suit in the prison, or just things like that, really. So yeah, that is certainly one of the more negative aspects I'll talk about in terms of the story. So yeah, the overuse of gags, the way that they are resolved as well. The drawings as well, I don't think they're particularly great. In some cases they look very, very basic. Tintin himself doesn't look kind of particularly recognisable compared to how he ends up looking later on. And even just in terms of the background and the settings and the backdrops and things like that, it does just seem that there wasn't really much effort put into the drawings. There wasn't much detail that was included. I don't really know why. It does feel like it was quite rushed, and it doesn't really, look like a particularly nice book. To be honest, it doesn't look like aesthetically or artistically. It doesn't really look like a well drawn, well stylized sort of comic book. To be honest, and obviously it being a comic, that's one of the most important aspects of it. So yeah, those are kind of the main problems I have with the story in general. There are a few other little things I can nitpick at as well. One of these examples might be that towards the end of the story, without spoiling too much, Tintin basically uncovers like a major terrorist who just happened to be a barman who he was staying in a pub with, and I just thought, like, wow, really? Like, you just happened to stumble across this random guy who happened to have this grand master plan to, it was something like blow up every city in Europe or something like that, It just felt very, very tacked on at the end and very kind of odd. At times, the story does make light of what were pretty tragic events that happened in the Soviet Union. There is a mention of the kulaks, which were a kind of, I believe they were like a farmer class who were heavily persecuted during Soviet times. And unfortunately, in the story, they do kind of make a bit of a jibe at it, a bit of a joke about it, and I just felt that was kind of inappropriate, really, considering how brutal the crackdown was on the kulaks in the Soviet Union. There's a few times as well where you could argue that the characters are pretty stereotypical as well. It's kind of almost meant to be just putting Russia and the Soviet Union in a completely negative aspect, and it almost feels like in some ways the book is like a propaganda piece rather than just a well written and a well told story about a young reporter who goes over to the Soviet Union. There's also as well, outside of Tintin himself, there's not really any interesting characters that appear in the story. Like, there's no kind of central villain. There's no other character that you come across who has any kind of interesting character about them, except that they're just like a typical evil and sometimes pretty dumb villain who can't really get rid of Tintin or solve or find a way to actually get rid of the reporter. And yeah, I just felt like when these things added up, it kind of unfortunately concludes the fact that it's not a particularly great story overall. Okay, so I've talked a lot about the negative aspects of Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, and you've probably guessed by now that my opinions of the story aren't particularly great. There is one final thing I do want to say just before we move on to the good sides and the good things about the story. So one last quick negative aspect I want to mention is the exposition. There are times, guys, where exposition I think is needed. You may need, and at the end of the day, every single story does need a bit of exposition to kind of maybe set forth the events that had happened before the story or are going to happen and kind of give the reader some sort of idea what's going on. But in Land of the Soviets, I think the exposition is done really, really poorly. Like, there'll be situations where there's been an obvious time skip, and rather than Hergé maybe just doing an extra panel to kind of show what was going on, or another few panels, something like that, he just kind of then jumps to the next panel and says, for example, Tintin was trying to get through a door at one point in the story, and literally you see him go down this ladder to go down underground to try and get into this door, and effectively what happens is that Tintin, in the first panel, he'll go down and he goes to the door, and then literally the next panel, Tintin just sort of says, I've been waiting here for an hour trying to open this door, and it just felt like that there was a very odd kind of time jump, or like I said about the exposition, where there'll be moments where the character will just blatantly say what their plan is rather than just kind of showing it, which I think is extremely important to do when you've got a comic story. You want to kind of show the reader what's going on rather than just telling them what's going on. Just one other example quickly, at the very start of the book, before Tintin even gets to Russia, there's a guy, like one of these kind of like Soviet spies again, who has been tasked to try and get rid of Tintin. He decides to use a banana, which is kind of funny in itself. It's kind of a stupid thing, and it's meant to be sort of silly, really. But he decides to use a banana and leave it outside a restaurant, so hoping that Tintin will slip on this banana and then fall over and like crack his head open or something like that. And basically, the guy, literally, as he's doing this step by step, he basically is just telling the reader what he's doing. It's like, well, we can see what you're doing. We can see what the idea is. Um, and although the gag itself is kind of funny and it's supposed to be silly and stupid, it's just the aspect of where it's just like, the character is almost directly telling the reader all the time what they're doing, what their plan is. It's like, why not actually show it through the drawings rather than just blatantly and obviously telling people what is going on. Obviously, I know that this was aimed at kids back in the day, this story, so there is probably a certain amount of exposition that is needed because kids may not always get 100% what's going on. But I did certainly feel, though, that in this story, compared to other Tintin stories, there's a lot of kind of like, oh, this is what I'm doing, and just kind of directly telling the reader what's going on. Those are the final kind of few things really in terms of the negative stuff. So the exposition and also the random time jumps between like one panel to the other, which kind of felt a bit like it threw the flow of the story off a little bit. Anyway, let's get on to the good stuff. So Tintin himself, I think, is a good enough character. I think he does carry the story well enough, and you can clearly see that although this is the very first Tintin story, the origins of the character are here as well. He's very, very competent, he's very smart, he clearly is, a very intelligent character, and I think, people will find him pretty likeable as well. They will also find the same, I think, with Snowy, his companion, who in the earlier Tintin stories, because, obviously Haddock and Calculus got introduced later on, Snowy was a much more prominent character, and, sometimes as well, the dialogue that Snowy has, whether Tintin can actually hear it or not is quite unclear, because he doesn't really sort of directly respond to it. Some of the dialogue that Snowy has is quite funny, and I think he does add a lot to the story, and he's a nice kind of little sidekick comedy character to have as well. There's some moments as well that will make you laugh between Tintin and Snowy, and their companionship and the way that they kind of solve the problems together. I think, certainly those aspects of the story, Tintin himself and Snowy himself as well, those two characters are good parts of the story. Apart from that, I guess you could say some of the gags, although there are a lot of them, as I mentioned before, some of them are quite funny, and, you will maybe laugh a couple of times at the story because of how either silly they are, ridiculous they are, things like that. There are some good moments. There's some interesting, like, fight scenes as well, and one thing I will say as well, this book is certainly not boring. Although I did list a load of problems before, there is a lot that's going on, so it will certainly keep, especially younger readers, really entertained, and it will keep them invested in the story. And because of that overuse of gags and stuff, I guess you could say it does make the story quite interesting, and that there's lots of stuff going on. One final thing as well, I guess, for anybody who is genuinely interested in the Soviet Union, although I did say that this kind of serves as a bit of a propaganda piece, and it does feel that way sometimes, it will give you an idea of what went on in the Soviet Union, because you have to remember that this was written back in 1929 and 1930, so this was literally going on at the time, and it was also it's kind of a window into how Western Europe saw the Soviet Union, what the West thought of the Soviet Union back in the day, what was the kind of common opinion of people, how did they view the Soviet Union and things like that. So I guess it's kind of like an interesting window into the past to kind of see how Europeans thought of the Russians and the Soviet Union, and just I think it's in some ways a bit of a history lesson as well. With everything in mind, the good and the bad, I think I'm going to give Tintin in the Land of the Soviets a final score of 3 out of 10. It sounds very, very low, and there are a few things that do kind of uphold the story a bit more. But unfortunately, I do feel that this story wasn't really a great one, to be honest. I think what the series became later on was far better, and there were so many great stories later on. Unfortunately, this one, in regards to the drawings, in regards to the majority of the story, the way that it's told, the kind of some of the inappropriate, offensive stuff that is certainly considered by contemporary standards that's in the story, the lack of any really interesting characters, the exposition-heavy dialogue sometimes, really do hold the story back, and I feel as well that, just generally speaking, it certainly wasn't one of Hergé's best work. But at the end of the day, there were better things to come. It was a start. It gave us an introduction to Tintin and Snowy and kind of the format and the adventures that would follow later on. So yeah, I think a 3 out of 10 is about as fair as I can be with Tintin in the Land of the Soviets. Okay everyone, so those are my thoughts on Tintin in the Land of the Soviets. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know in the comment section what you think of Tintin in the Land of the Soviets, if you've read it, and what you think of the series as a whole. And yeah, I'll be back very soon to do the next review in the series, which will be Tintin in the Congo. And yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed. Take care, I'll see you soon.